Welcome to Next in Tech, an S&P Global Market Intelligence podcast where the world of emerging tech lives. I'm your host, Eric Hanselman, Chief Analyst for Technology, Media, and Telecom at S&P Global Market Intelligence. And today, we're going to be discussing Mobile World Congress, the global gathering of all things telecom that's going to be taking place in Barcelona. And with me to discuss what's going on, what we can expect, is this part of the team that's going to be out there as we're descending on an MWC. It's analysts Lynnette Luna, Julber, Osio, and Mohammed, Hamza. Welcome to the podcast to all of you.
Thank you.
Hi, glad to be here.
Hi, Eric, and thank you. Looking forward to an interesting discussion.
Well, interesting and wide-ranging. And in fact, I actually haven't been in person in Mobile World Congress for a bunch of years, since before the pandemic. And in preparing for all of this, looking at everything that's going on, it just continues to expand and become ever larger, ever more comprehensive. I guess I was looking at the themes. It's crazy this year, although I think most of you have been there in person before, right?
Yes, I've been there several years. I think last year was the first time I went after the pandemic. I think I hadn't been there for 2 years. Total information overload, but very exciting to come back and kind of digest everything that you've learned at this. I think almost 100,000 people show up. So
yeah, that's
pretty impressive.
It's 100,000 of your closest friends, right?
Uh-huh.
But Mo, you've been there before, and Julber, you've been there as well?
Yeah, so I went last year for the first time in over a decade, actually. So my beat had changed from mobile to fixed back in the day when I was at a previous research company. So things have changed a huge amount. And I think this is where it's interesting in that the shift has been very much from consumer to industrial enterprise, B2B focused rather than the Mobile World Congress I remember, which was full of devices from Nokia and others. So the world's changed a huge amount for sure.
Well, I mean, the last time there was a Nokia handset that we were thinking about was a while back. But I guess I was just looking at the themes, and there are 6 themes this year, which seems like a lot. But they seem to cover a much wider range. And I don't know if we're getting to something that is the scale and size of a consumer electronics show kind of thing, but maybe almost. I mean, 5G and beyond, which, okay, great. That seems like that makes sense. Connecting everything. Yes, a lot of connectivity there. Humanizing AI. As my listeners know, I guess we've got to talk about AI everywhere all the time. So, okay. But manufacturing digital transformation, game changers, our digital DNA. I mean, talking about a lot of issues really that are going beyond just the real core pieces that we've always had as part of telecom. And there's a lot going on here. And I guess when you start thinking about what's there, I mean, maybe we could narrow it down by thinking about what the specifics are, I guess, that we're going to be looking for and the kind of things, I guess, that we should be looking out for that are going to kick out there. I mean, you were talking a little bit about some of that transformation. Julber, what are you looking for and what do you see as turning up as part of MWC?
Eric, actually, I'm looking forward to 2 things. First is discussions on how to monetize 5G, particularly the shift from consumer 5G to enterprise 5G. And it's been coming up in other conferences that I've been, like there's this discussion about how consumer 5G is not living up to its promises. That's why operators are moving towards enterprise 5G. And another thing that I want to talk about is also about spectrum. I know that spectrum has been a topic in previous MWCs, and most of the spectrum in the whole world has been harmonized, but still, there are lots of gaps that needs to be filled, especially after the WRC just last year in 2023.
Oh, yeah, that opens a whole bunch of questions. And World Radio Conference, for those of our listeners who aren't familiar with it, that continuity of spectrum and availability of spectrum is one of those things that gets back to some of the fundamental aspects of the telecom pieces of making sure that, in fact, we've got coverage and we've got coverage that's aligned across the globe. Those are the kind of things you're going to be looking towards?
Yeah, that's right. If I may just discuss what has happened in the previous WRC. WRC 2019. That's a big thing for the mobile industry because the ITU, International Telecommunications Union, opened up millimeter wave for mobile, and everyone was excited for that because it opened up large swathes of spectrum for the industry. But as we've seen in the US, they're the only ones who really went for millimeter wave 5G. The rest of the world has been big on mid-band on 3.5 gigahertz. Now, the interesting thing is that with WRC 23, it officially harmonized mid-band spectrum, 3.5 gigahertz worldwide for 5G. So it would be interesting to see how this would play out in terms of the roadmaps of regulators worldwide, as well as the strategies of operators and the vendors who build the technology for the mobile industry.
Thinking about where that starts to expand. Now, I mean, harmonization now means that, hey, we've got common environments in which to manage this, but mid-band is one of those areas in which we're looking for the ability to get coverage, to get range, to get in-building penetration. And those are things that we think about, I guess that feeds into the connecting everything piece. A lot of that is that linkage and some of the transitions that are taking place both in the consumer markets and in commercial markets, especially when we start thinking about things like fixed wireless access, which, if you think about one of the places where we have been having some reasonable 5G success, there's some reasonable traction there. And Mo, those are things that you've been looking after, yeah?
Yeah, absolutely. I've always been very skeptical and maybe slightly cynical as well in terms of fixed wireless and the adoption generally of new mobile technologies. I've lived through the GPRS, the Edge, the 3G opportunities that never happened. It wasn't really until HSPA, LTE, stuff like that, those iterations came along that mobile started to transform. And then, of course, the iPhone kicked it all off for the consumer market. And during that same kind of, if you like, 3G disaster zone that took place with the cost of the spectrum that was essentially overdone by many a government, you had the whole WiMAX situation, right? And you remember Sprint and you remember that whole kind of effort there to go WiMAX, go wireless broadband instead of mobile. That really blew the industry up in terms of everything from IPR disputes to actually getting the devices and everything in place. And I think that ecosystem development is really what's missing at the moment, in a sense that, you know, all of these technologies are enablers, but without all the relevant parties, all the relevant actors from vendors to industrial factories and companies and enterprise being involved, this stuff tends to sit and not go anywhere. I mean, with fixed wireless, especially, like if the operators aren't willing to commit that capex in terms of building the density of the network out, it's never really going to be a solution that is effective enough. I mean, you know, especially if you look at that within the context of low orbit satellites and those sorts of deployments from Starlink and many others that are becoming the choice for consumers, at least in terms of that immediacy of connectivity and the reliability of that connectivity. You know, often the case fixed wireless, you know, at this stage anyway, it's almost like a bit part solution that operators haven't fully committed to, in a sense, to really drive that uptake forward. And I think in some sense, if you look at markets like the US, I feel almost like the fixed wireless take-up is almost out of desperation than an actual network that is capable of delivering the kind of speeds that people expect. I mean, that's a slightly cynical view, but it is true in the sense that it takes a long time for tech to get to where it wants to be. And I think
Analysts
that's where
being cynical. How strange.
I think US operators, they had some extra spectrum. Hey, let's put some fixed wireless out there. It's not going to compete with fiber, but it'll fit with a certain niche. And we're only going to put it in areas where congestion is not a problem. So it's kind of like, here's some extra revenue and we're going to host it off of our same network. So we'll see where it goes from there. Mobile's still the priority for operators in the US, but
but you've really called out what is that issue, and which is that they sort of said, yeah, we're going to do a little bit of this, but you know, and of course, consumers have picked it up because it's easy. It's exactly the ease of deployment thing that It's always good and useful for technology. But if the operators haven't actually built for it, suddenly you move from what is a handset experience, which is going to be relatively low bandwidth, to now having a household running an internet connection off fixed wireless. Suddenly that puts stresses on the network that's supporting it. You have to have the backhaul capacity to manage it. And it gets to be an even more complicated situation than the bad old days of cable oversubscription, right? When all the kids came home from school and suddenly your available bandwidth was massively oversubscribed and had all sorts of problems. But
yeah, I think they're being careful right now about where they offer the service. Like I can't get Verizon fixed wireless because they've got the number of users that they're only going to allow on that. So it'll be interesting how they want to scale that going forward. Back to the spectrum issue, 3.5 is great. In the US, it's encumbered by the Department of Defense. And so there's kind of a little skirmish going on there about whether that can be shared and when that can be released. It may be quite some time. So all the spectrum in the US is encumbered by somebody else, mostly the Department of Defense. So these two government agencies, the FCC and the Department of Defense, will have to determine how they can share most effectively in that area.
And do we really want to be skirmishing with the Departments of Defense? Who wins there?
Yeah.
But I think that is one of those situations in which, all right, we've at least now gotten some level of harmonization that hopefully starts to open up opportunities globally, just in terms of how device manufacturers and all of the infrastructure pieces start to support it. I think there are aspects of that I guess we're going to have to keep an eye on.
Totally, because if we harmonize spectrum, it would be easier for our partners in the other industries, in the industry verticals, for example, the technology vendors, for them to easily build products that would work everywhere they want to market their products. And particularly right now, Lynnette mentioned about the US skirmishes in the mid-band. There's also another one brewing just because of WRC 23. The 6 gigahertz band has been opened up for mobile, and the FCC in the US has already allocated it for unlicensed Wi-Fi. So there is still going to be some challenge on that part if the US is not going to be aligned with the rest of the world. And it's going to mean another thing. China is a big proponent of mid-band, specifically 3.5 gigahertz to 4.9 gigahertz. So if the US will not align themselves with 6 gigahertz, China might become more dominant in the tech scene as they engage with the technology manufacturers worldwide using 6 gigahertz.
You've got two very large markets that, if they're not well aligned, you got manufacturers that are going to head for opportunities.
Right.
And that starts to segment and bifurcate the market, which is one of those things, again, in the telecom world, we've got much more, I guess, a greater global focus because of the fact that we're talking about what ought to be hopefully unified and harmonized radio infrastructure, device infrastructure, that ecosystem. I mean, Mo, to your point, it's a much larger environment that has to be built out in order to support that. But again, I guess still a few hiccups in terms of what's actually how we're going to be able to move forward.
And the use cases vary, right? So, you go to different geographies, different locations. I think if you look at Europe and you look at the amount of fiber that's being laid to 90+% of households, the fixed wireless opportunity in itself is going to be very small compared to what you see in the US. And that's going to be, in Europe and other places, going to be shared with satellite. So, yeah, the fixed wireless opportunity is going to be something that I think takes hold in very specific markets, especially in Europe, where connectivity generally at home especially is pretty good. There's a real melee these days for fiber deployment. So, yeah. Fixed wireless, maybe. Satellite, maybe. It is good.
Because satellite, talk about ease of use. All you need is a clear view of the sky and off you go. It is something where I guess where we're seeing some of the numbers we have, Starlink subscriber numbers are way up, skyrocketing, shall I say. We've got Amazon with Project Kuiper. Granted, they've now launched, I think, a grand total of 2 or 3 of the satellites of what is their final constellation that will need to be thousands, but they're starting. So maybe more competition in that market as well. But I guess that larger question is, what other options are there? And again, in the US, we've talked about the large amount of investment that's being pumped into broadband access. Those are areas that, again, maybe we're trying to approach that. There's been a fiber focus there. Maybe there are options in fixed wireless that start to pick up some of the slack, places where we still are having trouble getting fiber out into rural environments. But a lot of different things to juggle here.
Yeah, indeed. And I think in the satellite stuff specifically, I think what's interesting now is that we've had satellite broadband availability, for a long time, but it's only in the last year or two that it's really become viable in terms of speeds. It's come a long way. And I think that's really going to be a game changer for satellite, at least in the consumer market. And there's other opportunities emerging for that as well. Satellite backhaul and IoT connectivity. But that takes us to a whole different world of kind of services and applications as well.
Well, as you're saying, it's expanding beyond consumer. And consumer, clearly, there's a lot of visibility. I mean, when you've got iPhones that have got, albeit rudimentary, satellite communications capability, that starts to raise consumer awareness. But it was just last month that Deere & Company, the folks behind the John Deere agricultural equipment business, have announced a partnership with Starlink in which they're going to put Starlink antennas in the roofs of their agricultural equipment, harvesters and such, so that in remote areas, I think originally they were going to target Brazil, but basically places where their expectation is they're going to rely on satellite-based connectivity to be able to connect to devices that need that always-on, anywhere access. So a lot of commercial possibilities that are opening up there as well.
Yeah, I think that's pretty broad as well in terms of capabilities that satellite can support, right? So remote devices, remote retail, remote banking, essentially anything that's remote, I think satellite will play a part.
Well, if we start thinking about where we are in terms of a lot of this transition at Barcelona, I'm going to be looking for some of those indicators that we've got real adoption, key technology, especially in areas that I'm looking for, some of those automation of infrastructure pieces, some of the things, again, maybe moving beyond the AI hype, but starting to look at some of the real applications. I'm curious for each of you, are there particular things that you're looking for at Mobile World Congress that are maybe some proof points about industry trends or things that you're looking to see that are actually proving out some of these shifts we've been talking about?
So sometimes it's hard to find what's real and what's not at Mobile World Congress. Obviously, it's all about the future. We always want to look towards the future, and we have these hype cycles where we think something's going to be adopted, but it's not, and it's taking longer. It's just a cycle that the whole industry goes through.
You're saying there's hype out there, Lynnette?
So now we're talking about 6G, but we haven't even finished rolling out 5G. So I think what I'm looking at, and I look at the consumer side, which, isn't as actually, I used to say the consumer side was way more exciting than the enterprise side. And that's now the opposite. But on the consumer side, what I'm looking at is, it's kind of consumer side. It's more B2B, but this open gateway initiative that was introduced last year, the GSMA introduced that as a way, opening up APIs to the network to allow developers to access the network and use some of the network functions to offer services. Carriers realized that in the 4G world, they just let over the top players run over their networks and make new business models that they were not able to monetize. So now they're trying to open up these networks. They've tried to for a while, but it was very hard to get standardized APIs among all carriers. And I think with 5G, that makes it a lot easier with more open network architecture. And so that was introduced last year. I think I just saw an announcement from Orange and Vodafone and Telefonica that they are opening up the first couple APIs to developers around number verification and SIM swap. So it's more around like fraud and making sure accounts aren't taken over, or you can verify your number without having to get, instead of relying on an SMS number verification that you always get, right, when you try to log into like your bank. So making that more seamless. So that's not super exciting, but, the hope is you get applications that maybe have dynamic data speed elements with them. So, you get on an application, you get faster data speeds for that application, things like that. So it'll be interesting to see how that kind of pushes along.
Yeah, things like the Kamara initiative around APIs, so we're getting
is.
standardization and exposing some of those network services. It's interesting to see that those first applications are going for where there's real money involved. So fraud management, those sorts of things. That interesting to see where that heads. Yeah, again, it's one of those things where getting the operators to engage with developers always been a struggle, but again, hope now at least we've got some formalized processes and some pathways that hopefully start to open those up a bit. So, Julber, how about you? Well, what are you looking for? And are there proof points you're going to be hunting for as you're strolling the various halls? We've got 6 halls and just a lot of ground to cover, but what are the things you're going to be looking for?
Well, Eric, I like to say that I'm a pessimist when it comes to 5G, or maybe a realist. That's a better word. Because when you are in these conferences, you have all these new use cases that they showcase. But the reality in the world is none of these have a solid business case. Like when it comes to 5G around the world, at least in APAC, like consumer 5G is not really that profitable. For most consumer users, 5G is just glorified 4G. So these operators are now flocking towards enterprise 5G, and I see more opportunities there. In fact, in Asia Pacific, at least, since you have these big manufacturing countries like Japan, China, there's a lot of initiatives when it comes to private 5G. So I'm interested in seeing more applications on the manufacturing side, specifically on network slicing, because a good application of 5G on manufacturing is when you could slice a network, dedicate specific tasks to a certain segment of the network, and it will make the manufacturing process more robust and more agile. I would be interested in that. But if you were to ask me, like, is 5G really here? I am not so convinced.
Wait, but 6G is almost here. What do you mean? No, that's really been entirely the problem, right? And it's the thing that you were identifying earlier on, which is that there was all this hype, right? We're in the midst of it, about what 5G was going to do. And from the consumer side, I think reasonable levels of disappointment in that it was, it's faster, but we're able to actually accomplish it. And you pointed out things like spectrum slicing, the ability to dedicate capacity, is one of those promises. And in a lot of places in the world, you've actually got the version of 5G, what gets referred to as 5G standalone, for those of our listeners that aren't familiar with it, the idea that it's a pure 5G environment. Whereas in the US right now, we've got non-standalone, in which there's this sort of mix of 4G, 5G with signaling that's involved. And you can't yet, with the exception of T-Mobile, take advantage of a lot of those, what were the promised 5G game-changing features like spectrum slicing. Now, granted, you still have to have operators that build a business out of that. Getting operators to do new and innovative things have always been challenging.
Verizon and AT&T actually have standalone 5G, but they haven't really rolled out any consumer services. I think they're still testing on the enterprise side. But, things like network slicing will trickle down to the consumer market. I think I've heard T-Mobile talk a lot about using it for fixed wireless, being able to manage the growth better in their networks using network slicing and other advanced technologies, maybe talked about just for enterprise. And I think a lot of the enterprise, I think it'll be interesting. A lot of the enterprise applications like AR, VR will eventually trickle down into the consumer market, making it more useful. But, the surveys that we always do, which I'm going to actually write about one next week for our Mobile World Congress preview, continues to show that the primary drivers for carriers launching is just to increase throughput to accommodate higher data speeds. It's not that exciting, right? But it does in an indirect way increase revenue when you can start charging more for things like data plans without data caps and things like that. So indirectly, I think we're seeing some increase in revenue. It's not like super exciting where,
Yeah, but not new whole reborn service offerings
right.
that are now going to do something more than just bandwidth.
That'll take time. It just takes time.
Yeah, I agree.
Well,
And to add to that, I think it's a chicken and egg situation, Eric. Like, you have all these exciting stuff, but no one wants to invest money in them because the industry is I would say, a juncture point. Like, for the past few years, operators have been spending much on CapEx, on spectrum licensing fees, and anything for 5G. So now they are in the position to monetize 5G. And they've seen with consumer 5G, it's not that big of a revenue jump or a revenue stream. So all of them are flocking to enterprise 5G. So if there's no demand from consumers, there's no incentive for operators to offer new innovative services in the consumer side of 5G. And it's going to be a chicken and egg situation, I think, when it comes to investment and demand for it.
It almost kills itself in a sense, actually, because I think telcos, without spending enough money on innovation and network development, will in the future reduce their revenue generating potential. So I don't personally think they have much choice. I do think there's going to be obviously a timeline in terms of how these elements are built out. But I think if you look at the edge ecosystem specifically, I think that's where there's going to be a huge amount of opportunity. And that's something that's, I think, very viable. I think the ecosystem still needs to build out in terms of the CSPs and the slicing, the flexible connectivity, if you like, the intelligent traffic routing, the hyperscalers, the data center providers, systems integrators, vendors, operations, tech, and all the app development stuff as well. And then you get into the kind of the device makers and so on and so forth. And I think if you look at just private 5G as a solution, if you like, or a service, I think it encapsulates almost the revenue opportunity in itself for 5G in terms of what is possible when you have a dedicated 5G network. So, I mean, look at what they're doing with stadiums and arenas and sports and the Olympics, and the list is endless in terms of what's already been deployed out there. And then what they're doing with that in terms of AR and VR and these kind of next generation technologies. And that's where I kind of see a lot of positivity, is that I think there's a lot of potential when the network's built out in the right way. And then that enables the stuff that's not getting labeled at the moment, in a sense, whether that's automotive development in terms of connectivity and all the things, the data that goes with that. So that's where I am with that side of things. But I see private 5G as being pretty compelling.
Yeah, I agree with you, because eventually you can start hosting all sorts of, there's a big demand for gaming, right? So that's kind of more consumer focused, but yeah.
That's where what you're talking about comes into play, the gateway edge, the private edge, and the network edge, and any kind of edge you want to kind of come up with. But I think, that's where it makes sense, because bringing that compute to the edge of the network and enabling applications near their locations, getting rid of latency, improving connectivity between devices and networks and so on.
Well, that kind of brings us full circle, which is right back to the questions of the ecosystem that supports it in order to actually leverage it and to build a business around it. Wow, I guess a lot to cover. I'll certainly have my comfortable shoes on strolling the halls, but it'll be great to see all of you out there, and we'll have to follow up and see whether or not any of the things we've been talking about are actually going to come true.
Wear some good walking shoes.
Absolutely. The 20,000 steps, we'll be way beyond that.
When are we going to get robots that are going to take us around the, you plug in the stand location, the name of the person you're meeting, and it just takes you straight there.
Or just VR glasses. And we could just stand there and they just come in front of us.
Well, hey, maybe those are things that we will see out at Mobile World Congress, but hey, I guess we'll have to turn up there to check it out. Well, this has been great. thanks to all of you for all the insights, and clearly we'll be reporting back to see what we've covered. But thank you for being on the podcast.
Thanks for having us. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thanks, Eric.
And that is it for this episode of Next in Tech. Thanks to our audience for staying with us. And thanks to our production team, including Carolyn Wright and Caitlin Buckley on the marketing and events teams, and our agency partner, the 199. I hope you'll join us for our next episode, where we're going to be talking about connecting with customers, extending some of the conversations we've had that actually has a bit of a communications angle to it, but also some of the integration pieces, some of the API bits and how you incorporate those into applications and consumer interactions. I hope you'll join us then, because there is always something next in tech.